particularly after the Doklam crisis. There was this Wuhan summit had happened, and Mr. Modi had personally reached out to the Chinese president. If China was not interested in a normal relationship with India, then I think India had to change course.
A decade of India's foreign policy under the Modi government. What has changed? What has been the continuity?
You see in Bangladesh also, it's not that Sheikh Hasina has not had ties with China. In the case of Maldives, we have seen a one-sided attack on India, which has been quite unfortunate. We have seen a situation where India's ties with the West and India's ties with Russia continue to move on an even keel.
Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory at ORF as the Modi government seeks its straight third term. On this episode of the Ideas Factory, we will be looking at a decade of India's foreign policy under the Modi government, vis-a-vis India's relation with China, India's relationship with the West, India's relationship with its neighborhood, particularly Maldives, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and of course, very important, what has changed in India's relationship with the Gulf nations. So we will be looking at the continuities as well as the big shifts that we've seen in this decade. Joining me is Professor Harsh Pant. A very warm welcome to you, Harsh. We've, the election dates are being announced very soon, and also now we will be looking, probably this government is seeking a straight third term. So it's a very good time to look at India's foreign policy in the last decade. What has changed? What has been the continuity? One thing that is very, very obvious is the basic foundation of India's foreign policy seems to be the balance that it has maintained and India's freedom of choice. If we especially look at the global context, the Russia-Ukraine war, while India is saying that it's not the time for war, it has maintained its relationship with Russia. In the middle of all this, we also bought S-400 air defense system. We also, if Russia became the largest supplier of oil to India, but at the same time, India's relationship with the US also grows stronger. So it's interesting to look how India has balanced and maintained its independent position vis-a-vis what is happening at the global stage.
Naghma, I think it has been now a decade, and it is, I think, in some ways, kind of a marker for any dispensation. But I think in particular with how rapidly things have evolved, particularly in the last few years, it's a good time to look back. And the question that you have raised, I think, in some ways encapsulates, the India story at this particular juncture. Because for many, when the Russia-Ukraine war had started, it had looked like a very difficult balancing act. For many, this was a moment where, India would come under a lot of stress and a lot of strain to take sides, to pick sides, to move one way or the other, and certain very difficult choices would have been imposed on India. But I think given the unique moment that this is, given the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the moment, India has been able to navigate this relatively effectively. And in the process, if you look at it now, we have seen a situation where India's ties with the West and India's ties with Russia continue to move on an even keel. There is a sense of a balance that they have achieved with both sides, despite Russia and the West going all out against each other. And I think that space that India has been able to create for itself perhaps is the story of our times, that India at this particular point is able to balance competing interests, competing ideas, competing narratives, competing blocks in global politics, because India is emerging as a very important actor on the global stage. And most countries, most actors want to have a relationship with India that allows them to manage their own interests. So in that sense, I think paradoxically what we have seen, the Russia-Ukraine war has enabled that space to even grow for India, that India was able to articulate to the West why it needs Russia, and India was able to tell Russia that, look, this is not the time for war. India, more than China, Chinese president actually never publicly said anything, whereas Indian Prime Minister could publicly go and tell Mr. Putin that, look, this is perhaps not the way to go about it. So in a sense, this space that India was showcasing during this conflict is also the space that India has been able to manage and preserve for itself in the changing geopolitical landscape. And I think that's why a lot of observers have called it India's moment, that this is India's time, that perhaps India needs to take advantage of this particular point and inflection point in global history.
And what has changed in the India-US dynamics? You just mentioned how India maintained an independent standard vis-a-vis Russia, but at the same time, its relationship with the US has also grown stronger. Even its defense ties have grown stronger. We've also had visits by Prime Minister Modi, and every time he visited, we've also seen an outreach to the diaspora there. In fact, what is very visible and apparent to any layman is the intensity with which the Modi government is dealing with the diaspora, whether it's in the US or elsewhere. So what has, in this last decade, what kind of change have we seen there, and what the approach has changed, the style has changed? What is it?
If you're talking of the broader India-US relationship, it's quite striking that Mr. Modi has been able to deal with 3 American presidents. When he came to office, when Mr. Modi came to office, President Barack Obama was there in White House, and then you had President Trump, and then now President Biden. 3 very, very different presidents, very different temperaments, very different ideologies, and still you see. In some ways, if American foreign policies continuities you were trying to chart, you would see there are very few continuities given the disruption that particularly Mr. Trump was able to bring to the fore. But US-India relations have been the constant, that every single president has invested in this relationship, and they continue to believe in this relationship. So in some ways, I think what the Modi government and New Delhi, they have been able to articulate well, perhaps, is this idea that India-US partnership and a robust partnership is essential for the transforming geopolitical landscape of the Indo-Pacific, and that centrality had been kept in mind even as differences have emerged here and there. So it's not as if the relationship has been free of wrinkles. You have had Donald Trump's views on India's tariffs. You have had Mr. Biden's views on some domestic issues in India. You have had the situation in the Russia-Ukraine war. You have also had the case of the intelligence operations, alleged intelligence operations that India may or may not have carried out in the US. So in that sense, you see those differences were brought out, but they were brought out in a manner in which two mature democracies as partners could interact, could engage with each other, and perhaps understand each other better. So I think we have seen a dramatic shift in terms of the understanding that is now there between the two nations, between the two bureaucracies, between the two top leadership. And I think a lot of the credit has to go to the leadership, because they have been able to mobilize the bureaucracies to deliver on a number of issues which at different points in time would have looked very, very difficult. If you were talking of a different context. But I think that the leadership engagement, Mr. Modi's personal engagements, as well as the changing geopolitical shift in the Indo-Pacific, that has meant that India-US relationship has continued to grow and continued to expand across sectors. And I think that is again a very, very interesting story insofar as Indian foreign policy, insofar as the contours of Indian foreign policy of the last decade is concerned. And just very briefly on diaspora, and I think there, of course, we have seen a sustained attempt by New Delhi to engage the diaspora, as you mentioned, across geographies. But in particular in the US, if you're talking about Indian diaspora in the US has become very active over the last few decades. And I think we are also looking at now Indian leaderships, Indian political leaderships, Indian government responding to the rise of the diaspora in a manner that perhaps befits the stature that the diaspora now has in the American society, in the American polity and economy. So I think that engagement has been that engagement has been a very important lever in the relationship as the broader Indo-US relationship has evolved.
Okay, but what has really changed as far as India-China is concerned? We've seen the year 2020 marked a big change. There were violent clashes we saw in the Galwan Valley in eastern Ladakh. Recently, Foreign Minister Jaishankar made a statement that, the policy, India's policy towards China is guided by three essentials of mutual respect, sensitivity, and interest. He's also mentioned that it has now changed from Nehru's romanticism to Patel's realism. So do you see a big shift in the way we're approaching China or dealing with China, or is there a continuity if we talk of the last decade and the times before that?
I think China has been perhaps a big shift, I would say, but a shift that came also partly because China made it almost impossible for India to have a normal relationship with China, with China, with Beijing. And I think when you look back a decade back when Mr. Modi had come to office in 2014, there was a sense that this is a relationship that because of Mr. Modi's personal clout in India and because of the kind of authority that he commands in the Indian polity, he would be able to navigate the turbulence in this relationship. There was never any doubt that it's a very turbulent relationship. There was never any doubt that interests were diverging. But I think the means to manage that relationship, it was thought, and I think rightly, that given the divergence, given the difference in capabilities between the two countries, it is very important for India to have a relationship where that is civil, that is where engagement is continuous, and where top leaders can engage with each other. And you would recall, particularly after the Doklam crisis, there was this Wuhan summit had happened, and Mr. Modi had personally reached out to the Chinese president, and then you had the Mamlapuram summit as well. So both leaders were engaged with each other on a one-to-one basis. So when after all that investment, Galwan happens in 2020, I think it is seen as China's way of telling India that we are not interested. And if China was not interested and is in a normal relationship with India, then I think India had to change course. And that's what we have seen in the last 4 years, that a dramatic shift has happened where the onus is now on China. And that has been categorically stated by Indian policymakers, that the onus is now on China to make a case for its relationship with India. If it wants a normal relationship, then there are certain things that China has to do now, because it is China that has unilaterally altered the status quo along the boundary. It is not India that decided to go ahead and do something that was outside the normative frame. So I think in that sense, the relationship and the fundamentals of the relationship, they have shifted. And whether it is in terms of India building stronger partnerships, whether it is India developing its own internal capabilities, whether it is India trying to figure out where it can reduce its overexposure to China in trade and in investments, I think that is something that is now going to be very, very normal in India-China relationship, because a lot of these questions were about in the past that let's keep talking about the boundary question even as we develop our trade relationship, people-to-people ties. But I think India has now squarely put the boundary question at the heart of it, because certainly there has been violence, Indian soldiers have died, and there is no way that India and China can have a normal relationship without actually addressing the elephant in the room. And that's what India seems to be conveying to the Chinese. If the Chinese are indeed interested in having a relationship, then I think they would make a move. So far, they've not done that. So maybe they are waiting for these elections to get over and see who comes to power. But I think that is a lot now depends on how China responds to what India is now making very, very clear are its red lines.
But China has also not stopped making inroads, or has actually made big inroads, deep inroads into our neighborhood, be it Maldives or Nepal or Bangladesh. So India's policy towards its neighbors, especially if we look at Maldives now and the hostile Moizu government that we are dealing with, and the recent the trouble that we saw between India and Maldives relationship, and the China angle there, China actually flaring up the problem. So how have we managed our relationship with our neighbors, particularly Maldives, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And also, this government has tried a policy of religious affinity too with these nations.
Yes, I think you started this segment saying that look. Change and continuity. I think continuity, if there is one aspect of continuity in Indian foreign policy, it is that neighborhood is always going to be critical for India and how we manage the neighborhood. And I think China's rise and China's engagement in our neighborhood is a continuous shift that we have seen, how its footprint has expanded, how its diplomatic, military, economic engagements have expanded, and I think that's going to be the story again going forward as well. That there is no way India can exclude China from the neighborhood, from South Asia and Indian Ocean region, and that also gives states in India's neighborhood agency in shaping their own ties with India. So I think building relations with China allows them some leverage with India, and I think that's the foreign policy strategy all countries that have these big neighbors they play, and I think India's neighbors will also do that. So one thing that we have seen over the last decade also is these ups and downs. Sometimes you have India having an upper hand in a particular country, seeming an upper hand. Sometimes you have China seemingly having an upper hand. I think I would just say that this is going to be again the new normal. I don't think we will ever get to a stage where any one, either India or China, will get kind of a predominance in South Asia and Indian Ocean region, and that perhaps could have been possible at some point in the past. And I think the other is that for states in India's neighborhood, there is always an incentive to do that, to balance Indian and Chinese priorities. Where the problem arises is that if you have an extreme tilt towards one side. And I think there we have seen the recent actions of the Maldives government, the Muizzu government, in a different light, where we have seen how India has been targeted and India has been made this villain by the government, where the fundamental facts are very, very simple, that you have a very limited presence of India in Maldives, military presence of India in the Maldives, 77 odd military personnel, 12 odd, medical personnel that are affiliated to the military. To make that a question of sovereignty and then to go ahead and sign a defense pact, which is opaque, which has no details being given to the public with China, I think there I think a lot of problems arise, and there you will see the challenge that will come for India in navigating a difficult terrain, because so long as there is a balancing, and that you see everywhere, right? You see in Bangladesh also. It's not that Sheikh Hasina has not had ties with China. It's not that the Wickramasinghe government in Sri Lanka does not have ties with China. I think the question is, how do you reassure India that India's red lines are being respected? How do you engage with India and China on equal terms? And how do you continue to maintain your own strategic autonomy? But here in the case of Maldives, we have seen a one-sided attack on India, which has been quite unfortunate, and it has inflamed passions on both sides, which is, I think, for two close neighbors, not a good place to be in. So I think broadly what we are witnessing is over the larger Indian Ocean and South Asian region, this seesaw struggle between India and China will continue, because that's the geopolitical story of our times, that India is rising, China is rising, and they will rub shoulders against each other. And I think that's what we are witnessing. They will rub off against each other. There'll be problems, contestations in and around India's neighborhood, and there'll be contestations in and around China's neighborhood. India is also expanding its presence in China's neighborhood, so there'll be challenges there as well. But I think from India's neighborhood perspective, that is the kind of story that will continue. That we will continue to observe it, and we will continue to see India and China both investing a lot, and rightfully so. India's neighborhood first policy has always been in place. You would recall that 2014 swearing-in ceremony of Mr. Modi. He had invited all South Asian leaders. In fact, even the Pakistani leadership was invited at that point in time. But I think in the neighborhood, India continues to invest. We will also see Mr. Modi visiting Bhutan next week. which is again very interesting. Given that we are already in the election season, and he's in reaching out to Bhutan, so I think we are looking at a very interesting landscape in the neighborhood. But India's neighborhood first policy, again, I think is going to be a big continuity in whatever happens in the elections.
Okay, India will continue there with its neighborhood first policy, but the China challenge continues. Now, to conclude this conversation, Harsh, if we look at the big picture, what has been the style of diplomacy of this government over the last decade? What is the difference that you see in the approach? Especially a case in example is how we have amped up our relationship with the Arab nations. India also always had friendly relations with Egypt and some other African nations, but the Gulf monarchies like UAE and Saudi Arabia, the kind of relationship, the strong relationship that we are seeing there now, there has been a great effort also by this government. So does it also say anything about the style of diplomacy that this government has undertaken?
Yes, I think what it says is that for a nation of India's size, for a nation of India's capabilities, you need not always be defensive about your own ambitions, and you need not always be defensive in putting out your own story, to nations far and wide. Because for a long time, the argument in India was that, look, because of the religious affiliation, Pakistan will always have an upper hand in the Middle East and in the Gulf, right? Mm-hmm. And that, I think that myth has been broken. That you now see, and you would recall very well when Mr. Modi had come to power, one big question was how will a supposedly Hindu nationalist government and a prime minister, how will he deal with Islamic nations, and whether he will have the political capital to deal with them, and whether they will reciprocate. And I think what we have seen at the end of a decade is that not only have they reciprocated, but they have reciprocated in a manner that was almost impossible to conceive before. So I think this breaking of the dehyphenating of our Middle East policy from Pakistan has been a big boon. And I think engaging Middle East on its own terms, on 21st century terms, has been very important. That Middle East is no longer the Middle East of 20th century. Here you have Saudi Arabia and the UAE, major players in the region, trying to reconfigure their economies, and making them, more suited to 21st century realities. And there, India's capabilities, India plays a very important role. How India can work with them. So often in the past we have had this issue of that the only relationship that we have with the Middle East is of energy, and then of low skilled labor. But I think if you look at it today, it has been turned on its head. You have high skilled labor that Middle East wants from India. You have a situation where high end technology is driving the relationship. So I think in some ways what the Gulf and the Middle East ties tell us is that at times we constrain, or a nation like India constrains itself by mapping or configuring its ties, or looking at its ties with the nation, with the geography, with the country through a limited prism. I think today, in today's world, India is rising and the world is changing. So if you put these pieces together, you get a very interesting mix where India has space to maneuver. India can build its ties with the Arab states in the Gulf, with Israel and with Iran at the same time. And that is, I think, something which is very interesting. Though I think again, India's ties with the Arab states in the Gulf is of a very different order today than it was a decade back. You recall we are talking of IMEC, the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, something which again would look very fanciful in a different age. But today it looks very doable, and every country is invested in it despite the present challenges in the Middle East. And I think that in some ways sums up India's ambitions, that India today wants to be a rule maker, not a rule taker. India wants to be a country that is part of the global governance architecture, that is shaping the global governance architecture, that is also not shy of assuming responsibilities where they are due, and which is also in some ways responding to this particular moment in time in history where global leadership is missing, and perhaps India and Indian policymakers feel that they can fill the void. And I think that's a right approach at this point of time in global politics. And I think for Indian foreign policy, if the trends are anything to go by, if the idea that India is going to be one of the it is one of the fastest growing major economies, and it will be the top 3 economies very soon. If that is the trend, then I think India will have to continue to play this role, and India will have to continue to up its game in the diplomatic space. And that's the trajectory that we have seen over the last decade as well.
All right. Thank you so much for that analysis, Harsh. So the big points that you mentioned, of course, is also that world is changing and India, it has space to maneuver. Also, many analysts, many experts feel that this is India's moment. There has been a big shift in the Middle East policy, the dehyphenating of India, Pakistan. And of course, India is not shying away from, expressing its ambitions and working towards it. So that has been something that we have witnessed over the last decade. Now we just hope that this continues. Of course, there is time for change in the government. If present government comes back, then this is something that we will see as a continuum. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode. Thank you, Harsh.